author, audience, context, the idea of an author writing, theologically motivated, being selective, choosing to use some things and not other things. So a great example of this, if you turn to the very first chapter of Ezra, and Ezra being one of those authors who's writing down history and evaluating the present circumstances and situation in that post-exilic time. People have come back, they've rebuilt the temple, they've had church for a while, and certain things are having to take place, and house cleaning, and Ezra's come in to kind of recharge the spiritual life of the covenant community that's come back out of 70 years in Babylonian exile. So the precipitating event, he starts with, in the very first chapter you see, Cyrus's decree, the Persian king, 538, issues a decree, an amazing decree that basically, as you see, allows and decreed that Israel can come back. It acknowledges, verse 2, he acknowledges the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all kingdoms of the earth, and he's appointed me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever there is among you, of all of his people, may his God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem. And then you have the rest of it there in verse 4. So that makes sense. That's a historical document, external to the Bible, but brought in and then plopped down front and center as a reminder. How does God work behind the scenes? God's got our back. I mean, he's using a Persian king to free us and to let us go back, and this friendly notion, and here we are. You know, it all started with that. That's the precipitating event. If we turn one page back, if you remember, we have a different author who's writing, interestingly, to the same audience. This is the post-exilic audience. This is another historian, the chronicler, the author of Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And he's also addressing the same group. They've had church for a while. And we see in some of the other accounts in Ezra and Nehemiah that there's a group that they've encountered some opposition. The temple rebuilding was started and stalled and restarted again, and even after it's done, it was built with rubble, leftovers from Home Depot. I mean, you know, it just did not look like the Solomonic temple in all of its glory. I mean, is God ever going to come back and fill this temple with his presence and his Holy Spirit? I mean, is that going to happen again? And the author of Chronicles says, well, let me end my historical account with the Cyrus decree. And here's how he does it. Thus says in verse 23, starts the same way. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever there is among you, of all of his people, may the Lord his God be with him, and let him go up. Everybody would have said, well, keep going. You know, there's more. We all read Ezra's account of history, and we know there's more to the Cyrus decree. What are you doing here, Mr. Chronicler? Well, this is a great example of an author having a theological bias. He's writing intentionally. He's selective. He leaves something out. The last half of the Cyrus decree, he ends the Cyrus decree on a verb that is the invitation voice. Let him go up. It's an invitation. It's a command. Where? But the audience is saying, you're giving us an invitation to a party? What is this? So you start to ask the question, what's the author saying? What's he intending to do? If the whole point of the Cyrus decree was to get Israel back to rebuilding Jerusalem and their spiritual lives and the temple and all of that, you start to ask questions like this. Maybe the author of Chronicles has something else in mind. Maybe he's saying something like this to his audience. You know, you're all discouraged about this building. He's pointing to the temple that's right in front of them. God's got more for us. Let him go up. Where? To another temple that's coming. There's a king who's coming. It's not about any earthly king from this point on. There's another king who's coming. Let him go up. It's that invitation to the day of the Lord. It's that trajectory the bookend idea that we've been talking about. It's as if the author of Chronicles has his prophet hat on, and he's fully aware that God's got even more agenda for the faithful in Israel. The day of the Lord's coming. Let them go up to the day of the Lord and participate in all that we've already heard prophets talking about. What's going to happen on the day of the Lord? The king will establish his kingdom. The temple will be established. The water of life will flow. Trees of life will grow. The nations will stream up and participate in the instruction, the teaching instruction of the Torah. And all of these things will happen. Let them go up to that. So there's this future invitation. And it's the last word. Here's the canonical context. That's the last word that is in the Hebrew Bible. For all of the faithful who have read the Hebrew arrangement of the canon, Chronicles is the revelation of their book, their Bible. It's the Bible that Jesus would have had access to and read. Their last word as they would read the Hebrew canon in their time. So that's just an example of this as it all kind of comes together. So that's a great example or illustration to use with your people if you're trying to explain some of these things to them. So what does the text say? Now we're going to get into some of what we see in the text in Genesis chapter 1 through 11. And we're talking about an author who is responsible for bringing this text into the purview of his audience, the author Moses. And the context, the vantage point that we talk about for Moses is the look back, the look forward, hearing as a prophet, hearing from the Lord. So you've got a divinely inspired author hearing from the Lord, but also personally involved. And for Moses, a large portion of what he writes about in Genesis through Deuteronomy. So here's the picture, and I'm sure all of you know where this is. I'll give you a Hershey's candy bar next session if you can guess where this is. Come on. No. This is the plains of Moab. This is near the rock where Moses stood up and gave that moving last hurrah speech there in Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 15 through, where he stands on this rock and he's pointing. He says, "See, I have set before you today life and blessing, or if you choose to stay, death and curse." And there, in the distance, is the Jordan River from plains of Moab, which is a slightly elevated portion west of the rift that goes down to the Jordan River. And just across the Jordan River, about, I think, 20 miles approximately from this location, is Jericho. That's where it all begins. The battle over the Promised Land is about ready to begin. Moses is addressing Israel one last time because he can't go himself, right? He's going to have to stay behind, and eventually, we know, as a fitting tribute to the author of the Pentateuch, probably a scribe of Joshua, writes the account of his death in chapter 34 in Deuteronomy, which closes the chapter to the author of the Pentateuch, and that's Moses. So Moses is going to, by this place in the history of salvation, you've got Moses. He's been with Israel for 40 years. That's a long time to be in class. I call that the classroom experience for Israel. 40 years in the wilderness. What are we going to learn today? Well, how to trust in the Lord. Well, what are we going to do about food? Well, God's going to provide. What about water? We're running out of water. The Lord's going to provide. What about walking? All this walking, it's just wearing out the soles of my feet. Actually, it's not. It's not wearing out the soles of your feet. God's even providing for that too. So what's the lesson that we should learn today? That man should not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of the Lord, Deuteronomy chapter 8. Yes. Moses is going to remind them of that. After the experience, he looks back and he says, let's evaluate that experience. Well, what you should have learned is the most important lesson that you're going to have to take with you when you go over there. It's because you're not going to be the biggest nation. There's going to be some pushback. And, the commands that Moses gave you to fill, to rule and subdue, fill and multiply, those commands that he gave Adam are just as well as true for us now. We're going into this place to fill and multiply, rule, and subdue. To plant the flag of the name and the reputation of the Lord. That's what we're going to do when we go there. We're going to have to be together on this, gang. Moses is saying, to Israel, you're going to have your act together. All of these lessons that I've taught you, the patriarchs, all the mistakes they made, especially the brothers in the Joseph narrative that could never quite get along. Don't do that when you get into the promised land. Don't be those brothers. Be united brothers. Brothers that treat each other with loyalty and love. And you gotta have each other's back when you get in there. And what about how the battles that we're going to fight when we get there? Oh yeah, Moses, you taught us that in Deuteronomy 20. Yeah, how do we fight a battle God's way so that we can basically ensure that victory will be on our side? There's a certain way. What do we do when we have church? How should we build the temple? Oh yeah, you've already told us. You've explained that to us, So all of these are the lessons that we're going to pick up along the way as we go through the first 5 books of the Old Testament. But this is the vantage point that I like to come back to. And the difficulty that, and I talked about that my case for Mosaic authorship, one of the real challenges, if you don't hold to Mosaic authorship, that is, Moses is behind it, you get into the whole, and I remember I talked about the whole documentary hypothesis, the JEDP thing. And each letter in the thing represents a different so-called author, writing at a different time in history, to a different audience. So you see the difficulty that, I guess I'm giving kind of a broad label, but the more liberal Old Testament scholars that have bought into documentary hypothesis, they have a difficult time understanding and recognizing this amazing theological unity and continuity to the text. What is the one author saying when he unpacks the Abraham narrative for Israel? None of it. No, you don't. So here's the challenge: when you pick up a commentary in the library, or through Amazon, or through Kindle, or whatever, you need to recognize who that scholar is and where they're at on this. Otherwise, they may not be telling you everything that could be told, I would argue, with regards to the theology of at least the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Because if it's a unity, you've got one author / prophet / historian / leader / educated in the best schools in Egypt person, namely Moses, or you've got some unknown authors operating from the 10th to the 5th century BC. Who's their audience? I don't know. There's no theology there. I mean, it's all piecemeal. That's the thing that you engage in Old Testament scholarship. When you get into the higher levels, I got frustrated with the lack of theological insights that were coming, at least out of the first 5 books of the Old Testament. So it's like, well, if I take Moses' authorship seriously, yeah, I do. The theology screams off the page. So that's a little side bit for free there. So let's talk about, and here we have where the Bible's beginning. For Moses, it's interestingly not down here in the Promised Land. There's the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River, and the Dead Sea. Not here, down here in Egypt. We're up here in Mesopotamia. So the Tigris, Euphrates River Valley. So the first, the context for the first 11 chapters in Genesis is here. Abraham's hometown, I think it's probably here in Ur. They travel to Haran. There's where Abraham's father Terah dies. Abraham has to take the baton of faith and make the long track around, following what? You see it on the map. Following the water sources all along here until they eventually set up shop down here in the Promised Land with a few excursions to Egypt. But there's where it all begins, the patriarchal history. But the first 11 chapters, largely I would argue, are taking place up here. And even there, we learned that Mesopotamia and that ancient civilization, before even the time of Abraham, has a history of its own. And I just spend and I'm giving you this slide, so if you want to, you'll have this later, so you don't have to take too much detailed notes on this. But just talking about Old history, ancient history, all the way up to, basically, this is the period in history in Mesopotamia. So what was going on in around the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley? 3000 to 2000 BC. We call that the dynastic period. And it's interesting that in that time you see this great advance in things like ancient writing. You've probably heard of cuneiform. Those clay tablets start to emerge and they get dried in the sand and preserved forever. It's a great thing. But we learn about the development in Ur, Lagash, and Kish, some of these key cities. Abraham's hometown was one of the centers, interestingly, for this development. As early as 2700 BC, Ur was established as a dominant city-state in Mesopotamia. Closer to the time of the household of Terah, Abraham's family, 2000 BC, there's this Renaissance revival in art, literature, and law. So the legal idea, the legal codes, was actually a development in earlier times before Moses comes along. And also about 2000 BC, highly developed writing. So we have the circulation of treaty documents that we have, ancient letters, contracts, legal documents from Mara, Alaka, and Anatolia. So these are all civilizations in and around the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley. And cradle, some scholars call that the cradle of humanity area. So getting back to Moses, this is another view of where we are on the plains of Moab. So just slightly northeast of the Dead Sea, Jordan River. It's right along here. So remember we saw that view looking from the higher elevation down. And then over here would be Jericho, kind of this direction. So this is where Israel's going to begin their journey after Moses is going to hand the baton from himself to Joshua in terms of the what next. So I kind of took this all seriously and thought through it and started engaging in a kind of a personal, focus in my own learning life, because I never stop learning. And I'm always challenged, and there's always something more to think through. And some things I choose to bring into my lectures and my classroom experience. Some of them are still in wet cement, and they're not fully developed yet. So I'll clue you in on the things that I bring to class. Like there'll be something later this morning. I'll say wet cement, not fully developed, but I just want to share it with you for the purpose of exploration, because this is a master's level class. And on some things you may not always agree with me. You're entitled to disagree with your professor. Just don't yell at me. And, you got to admit with the Old Testament, there's going to be some topics we bring to class for the purpose of discussion. But what I try to do is help you understand what the limits for the conversation are. If there's a room for multiple positions, not sacrificing the basic doctrines of the authority of Scripture, the inspiration of Scripture, then I think, then we can have a conversation. And I do this because you need to recognize there are people in your churches who don't all agree on some of the things, issues of science and religion. Some of those things are sticky wickets. We have to at least understand what the conversation is. So we'll talk about that. And I'll tell you what I think, where I'm at in my current exploration. But if I tell you wet cement, it's not one of those things that I'm willing to die for, Because if you think about it, I always like to, throw this up in the discussion. If you think of it in terms of buckets, so those things that you derive from Scripture, you have three categories of buckets. This is my little chalk talk here. So first bucket is you have opinions. Opinions. You have a lot of opinions. From Scripture, you read, you study, you understand, and you fill your bucket with opinions. These are not things to break a church up over. You can have conversations over lunch with a group of friends and not throw beans at each other, not spill your coffee cup and get disgusted. I mean, these are just things to talk about, opinions. A lot of things are in that opinions bucket. A little less, you've got some things in the middle bucket called persuasions. I've thought about the things in my persuasions bucket a little bit longer. I've worked out some of these issues a little bit more with the text and my own personal study. And My persuasions bucket, I might come to you a little more forcefully. Let me say, I think I'm right on this, but I'm still your friend. I'm not going to break up a church up over any of these things. I'm not going to walk away, break fellowship over any of the things in my persuasions bucket. But there are things I hold to a little bit closer to my heart, to my truth center. And then I have my convictions bucket. So I have less things in my convictions bucket, but those are the things that I'd be willing to die for. And I have some in that bucket. Rightfully so, as you should as well. And I would break up a church up over these things. I would break fellowship if I was in a situation where I was going against anything in my convictions bucket. I'd walk away and figure something else out. So that's how I handle these things. So if you hear me talking about, well, I've got this thing in my opinions bucket, I've got these things, this one's moved over to my persuasions bucket, you'll understand what I'm saying. Fair enough? Okay? All right. And this helps you in your church, your churches, because there are people who have way too many things in their convictions bucket. They come at you, right? They are knocking on your door really loudly, and they threaten you because they've put something in their convictions bucket because of a speaker that came, or they went to a conference and heard something presented in such a way that it was a conviction. And you're looking at it saying, I don't think it's a conviction. That's not in a convictions bucket. That might be a persuasion. But you've put it in your convictions bucket. And let me challenge you to maybe back off a little bit, because this is not an issue to break a church up over, what you're talking about. It's something that you're entitled to a strong opinion about, or a strong persuasion about. But you're coming at me with way too much heat on this. And that sometimes is helpful to disarm and help the conversation go in a more productive way. So you can use that with high school students, and especially challenging high school students to have a few more convictions, right, before they leave home, go off to college and things like that. So, all right. So we're talking about Moses, plains of Moab, as we get ready to prepare and launch. He's an author now. He's hearing from the Lord. Moses is going to have his prophet's hat on occasionally as he's hearing from the Lord. He's looking back. He's also anticipating and looking forward. It's interesting in Deuteronomy, when we get to that book, we'll see how striking it is how much Moses does to motivate and anticipate Israel's experience in the Promised Land. All the way up to the place of, look, if you do this, you're going to go this direction. It's called exile. Moses says, if you do this and stay close to home, God will continue to provide and bless you in the land. But guess what? The land's owned by the Lord. You're a tenant. And your choice to stay in the land or be exiled from the land will be your future choice, O Israel. So choose wisely, is what Moses says. So he's got his prophet hat on. And he even says, look, if you go down this road, was this the road of exile? Yeah. So if you go down this road, exile, Moses even says, look, when you're in exile, if you repent, the Lord will hear you and bring the exiles back and restore and rebuild and replant. Moses has the whole, with his prophet hat on, he's been given a glimpse, a divine vantage point in which to lay out the trajectories for Israel. All right, so what's his very first lesson? This is where it gets interesting. And this is what I've tried to do, is go back and ask myself the question, as I read Genesis through this lens, what's the biggest idea? What's the number one lesson that Moses would have had intended for Israel? Because if I'm looking at the text of Genesis, I have to force myself to say, what would I have heard if I was sitting on the plains of Moab with my picnic basket open, eating brie cheese and peanut butter and jelly sandwich? Moses, what are you telling me today? That's the context that I need to have for Genesis chapter 1. So if you do that, and if we can turn to Genesis 1, and this is the theology. Moses the theologian. Most people don't think of Genesis 1 as Moses the theologian. It's like, oh, that's the chapter that I go to when I put on my boxing gloves and I want to debate somebody who's one of those evolutionary theorists guys. That's what I do when I go to Genesis 1, right? Well, my contention with you is that there's some theology that leaps off the page when we go and read it and try to understand it through the lens of Moses and his context. And I've hinted at this already, but you've got some interesting things that go on with how and what we see when we read Genesis 1, 1 through 31, the whole first chapter. God is speaking, and he's creating and establishing what I call domains. Domains is a realm, and the light in the heavens is one domain in verses 3 through 5. Then he establishes another domain. He talks about the firmament, verses 6 through 8. The sky and the seas, right? And then there's an establishment of another domain, the dry land, verses 9 through 10, and the addition of vegetation, verses 11 through 12. Then what he does is he establishes and creates what we would call the living things that fill those domains for the purpose of creation or created function, which is assigned by God. He speaks and assigns function to these living entities in which he creates and it puts in each of these domains. So some things, we're always, we're encouraged to read Genesis in the order of the days, 1 through 7. That's the linear reading. But here's what would be called kind of a symmetrical reading that's interesting, because you have the parallel establishment of domain, day 1, day 4. What goes in that domain? Day 2, the establishment of the domain of skies and seas. What it's created and goes in that domain? Well, we read in 20 through 23, the birds and the fish. And then the land animals in creation day 6 are created, and they're assigned function, fill and multiply. All right? And those animals are given domain, just as well as the birds and the fish, fill and multiply. I guess that's not assigned to the sun and the moon. They're just supposed to spin around and move. But they still have a function. So this is the establishment. And finally, we get to what we call the pinnacle of humanity, the pinnacle of creation, is that's us, the living critters. And we'll talk about that in terms of the image of God bearing responsibility. We have all of the commands of the animals, fill, multiply, but also the added commands, rule and subdue. So those are the things that we do. So after all of this creative activity from God, we move on to what I call is the pretty significant clue that Moses gives with regards to the theological high point of Genesis 1. And if we turn there, we'll pick up remember that the chapter and verse references weren't part of the inspired original text, right? We just keep on reading. So they're in chapter 2, verse 1. Moses continues, "Thus the heavens and the earth were completed and all their hosts. And by the seventh day, God completed his work which he had done. And he rested on the seventh day from all of his work which he had done. Then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all of his work which God had created and made. This is the account of the heavens and the earth when they were created, in the day that Yahweh God made the heaven and the earth." Capital L-O-R-D in my New American Standard Translation. Capital L-O-R-D is always a reference to the Yahweh, to the covenant name for God. And I can almost venture a guess that when Moses' first audience first heard this, there was a gasp, a moment of silence. And then perhaps after that, an applause and a cheer coming from the audience. Because from Moses, he is making it emphatic that God, Elohim, capital G-O-D, who's active in creating, he's establishing domains, and he's assigning life and function and purpose to all of the living things that fill those domains. This God who Moses is talking about, when this God sits, he rests and commands the same from all that is in all of the domains. Everything ceases to work and rests. And the only one that anybody would have been fully aware of in the ancient world that does that is a king. And that's who God is, Moses says, as well as the one that we met at Mount Sinai, the one who introduced himself to us by name, covenant name. He's the one who said, I am Yahweh. That's who I'm talking about, Moses says to Israel. And they would have said, oh, wow. You mean the covenant creator? You know, the God that we met at Mount Sinai, he's the one that invited us into relationship. He also created the universe and everything in it. That God? Moses said, yeah, that's what I'm saying here. Oh, so when we go into the promised land, we're representing him. That's what, wow. That's what Moses is saying. So he's talking about a king. And this is the king. And from the very first chapter, this is God as king, establishing his kingdom, the domains for him to rule, but also the establishment of, you might say, little kings to carry the torch and plant the flag of his name and reputation throughout the whole earth. Yeah?
Earlier you said that Moses had sources that he was drawing from. What would have been those sources?
That's a good question. I mean, we don't have any of the sources that he used to write the Pentateuch. When I say Moses' sources, now I did cover a little bit of this in my week 3 lecture, where I kind of talk about how the Pentateuch came to be. So I'm talking about probably, when you think of Moses as an educated author, the ability to write, probably had access, I could only speculate here, but access to ancient texts and documents that would have come and have been written down. See, kings in these major, kings in Mesopotamia, kings in Egypt would have had trade correspondence, and they loved filling their libraries full of each other's stuff. So how these things came to be in the patriarchal narrative, what was written down by the patriarchs and then brought into Egypt, we don't know for sure, but I would venture a guess, a strong combination of written and oral tradition. And as Moses kind of caught up with the reality of the fact that they're me, I'm one of them, the Israelites who have been in bondage for 400 years, what they're telling me about this history is mine, and I need to learn about it. So there was a learning curve for Moses as he kind of catches up with that. But at that point, we don't have it recorded. He's not giving us a lot of clues, but he's pulling from that history as well as being divinely inspired. I would say both. I mean, God's giving him what he needs to write down through whatever sources that he had available to him at the time. That's the best I can do on that one. All right, so creation day. So what we see here is the advance of Yahweh as king, and that's Moses' big idea, and what the king does. So humanity, all human beings, regardless of color of skin, country of origin, are tasked with this one job of reflecting the king as an image bearer of that king on earth. So it's interesting. If we turn to Psalms, let's turn to Psalms chapter 8. Psalms chapter 8. But we'll get into this as we look at some of the other Pentateuchal books, especially Deuteronomy. Moses would have had probably some scribes that would, as he comes back from hearing from the Lord himself, especially in terms of the teaching of how do we build the tabernacle, some of the more specific instruction that comes out of books like Leviticus on how do we make the sacrifices, the Day of Atonement sacrifices, and all of these very specific things. We have the evidence that Moses is hearing from the Lord himself. So we don't want to dismiss obviously the divine source of his inspiration. He's hearing from the Lord as a prophet at that moment, but he's writing it down or dictating it to someone who's writing it down for him. So he has a permanent, permanent record of that for the leaving piece that he has for Israel. This is his magnum opus. This is what he's preparing. Mr. Holland's opus. Mr. Moses' opus. I've never said that before. I don't know if it works, but all right. Psalm 8. Let's look at this and see how this is celebrated. These themes are celebrated in one of David's psalms. O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is thy name in all the earth, who has displayed thy splendor above the heavens. From the mouth of infants and nursing babes thou hast established strength, because of thine adversaries, to make the enemies and the revengeful cease. When I consider the heavens and the work of your fingers, the moon, the stars which you've ordained, what is man that you've taken a thought of him, and the Son of Man that you care for him? So, in light of all that God has created, the psalmist here, David, is reflecting on that. But then he says, well, who am I? What's my value as a human being in light of all of that, God, that you've done? So he continues on. What is man? So the question there in verse 4. Yet you have made him a little lower than, and what's your translation say? Angels? God. It's Elohim. I think it's God. That's the better translation. That you've made him a little lower than God. So there's the right there is the sense of God in his image stamped on humanity, the image of God bearer. A little lower than God. But the qualities of who we are as human beings mirror and reflect God. We are not God. There's that separation, of course. You'll learn about that in your philosophy course. But we bear his image. And we're doing things to reflect back to God based on certain image of God bearing qualities and attributes that we carry around with us and possess. And we reflect those things wherever we go. We plant the flag of the Lord's name and his reputation because it's in our DNA, you know. We worship God. Monkeys don't, you know. We're wired a certain way to do certain things on planet Earth. And that's true for all of us, regardless of race and nationality and country of origin and all of that. So, now, I don't bring this up to bring in any controversy. It's just the elevation of this fact that if we're in the world and we're hearing things, and this is a live nerve in our culture today. But when we think this way and really apply and think through aggressively the image of God and its implications, we do get into and understand that all lives matter. This is the foundation. But the tipping point is, if there's any example of injustice and unfairness, we know how to respond to that too. So if we talk about any movement around that's focusing on injustice, we have to be arm in arm and say, yes, there's truth there. Any injustice around the world, in our own country or anywhere. And we'll find that especially when we get to the prophets like Amos, injustice is a huge topic with the prophets, and how the poor and how the disregarded, the outcasts are treated by the wealthy elite. The prophet Amos screams against the injustice in his day. Yes, sir.
Kind of while we're talking about this topic, you know, this verse, Psalm 82:6, is usually very controversial, but, you know, it says, I said you were gods. Is this what this is talking about?
Say the first part again, the question.
Well, it says, I said you were gods, but it's with a little g. It's Psalm 82:6.
Psalm 82. Psalm 82:6, the question is about a text that refers to, I just have to look at it, 82:6. Let's see, I'm trying to get the context for this here. Psalm 82:6. This is one of those, I said you are gods and all of you are sons of the Most High. This looks like context more like judgment, so Well, the building blocks for, I might have to look at this a little bit more in depth to make sure I speak intelligently on this. I don't want to misspeak. But you see the reference to the sons of, you are gods. The word there would be in Hebrew, the Elohim idea. So the Hebrew word Elohim is plural. And in the biblical context, sometimes it refers to pagan gods, or in the pagan idea, gods, little g gods. But in some contexts, it refers to, you might say, what's called the plural of majesty, the one God in all of his majestic everything and everything in between. So the fullness of who God is captured by the one plural idea of gods, but we translate it capital G, God. So in the references to you are sons of gods, the question there we saw in the Psalm 8, some translators go with, you've made us a little lower than the gods, referring to angels. So sons of gods, the sons of Elohim, sometimes refers to angels in some contexts. But in some contexts, the sons of not gods, in other words, the majestic ones, the angels, if you say son of God, then that might be a reference to the fact that our image is stemming from the divine, that is God. We are connected to him in that way. So context is what determines how you sort all of that out. This is one of those passages that requires a little bit of some thinking and analysis. Yes?
It's a little, not off topic, but going back to the fact that we're made in God's image. At what point do we create an image of who God is? Because, we can look at, if we're thinking, we're made in God's image, then we were worshiping somebody that looks like a human, or somebody who's greater in the likeness of God. I don't know.
Well, that gets into, the question is, if we think of ourselves too proudly, arrogantly maybe, as I'm an image of God bearer. How close does that get me to being the real thing, or something like that? The caution line is that we aren't God. That's very clear. We're not God. He is separate. He's an entity separate from who we are in our essential being. So that gets into some philosophy stuff that you'll talk about in that class. But we have an ontological difference, uniqueness from God. There's attributes of how you're wired and how your brain works and your abilities and certain skill levels that separate you from, and I'm mostly in Genesis 1, I'm trying to make the distinction of humanity, image of God bearers, from the living critters, kind of that direction. Not so much looking forward in terms of the fallacy of Genesis 11 and the Tower of Babel account, which we'll get to next week, where they come, let us make for ourselves a name. That's the example of taking it too far, where we don't want to carry the name and reputation of God. We want to make for ourselves a name, our own name and our own reputation. We want to be little gods, not represent that God. Does that make sense? So that's part of the sin that the cycle of sin that we start to see spin out in the first 11 chapters. So yeah, you have to have a clear line in the sand and understanding. You want to make sure that you're recognizing those qualities and aspects of who I am. And I'll show you a picture here that I think captures it. One of the essential things that oftentimes goes underappreciated in terms of understanding what does it mean for me to be an image of God bearer. So it celebrates here. We have Psalm 8 right here, and kind of the level playing field of recognizing and valuing all human beings. There's a lot of injustice in the world, is there not? In all of its various sinful forms. I was at a theological conference for accreditation, the Association for Theological Schools, and they had they were talking seriously about the whole with the Black Lives Matter, some of those issues. And how do we deal with that? And some of us in the room, and then you have to understand that's a mix of liberal and conservative schools all thrown into the same room. So a few of us in the room were raising our hands and saying, do we want to talk about sin here in terms of injustice and try to understand this through the biblical understanding of sin and what that does? And the person on the stage said, we don't talk about sin. We're not talking about sin here. It's just like, I was a little bit taken back, like, no, that's not right. We want to talk about the image of God that levels the playing field of the value of all human beings. And then we can talk about aspects of sin that have contributed to the problem. But that didn't go that way, went a different direction. So, yeah.
According to the question of the other guy on Psalm 82, I think it ties to the point you're talking about. Because if you read the context, it's talking about you are gods, referring to the judges. That time, when they were having a field day of their pleasure, judging unjustly, afflicting the poor, and then it says, you are the mighty ones.
Yeah.
You represent God. You may judge unjustly right now.
There is.
One day, the judge of all the earth will come and bring you to judgment. So I think it ties to what you're saying.
Okay, yeah, you are sons of the Most High. Nevertheless, you'll die like men. So there's a pullback there, in a judgment that you recognize.
Yes.
This might be a good example of. If I look at it and bring it in, I'm interested in the idea of injustice might come in. Yeah, verse 3: vindicate the weak and the fatherless, do justice to the afflicted and the destitute, rescue the weak and needy. This is a clear example of how humanity has gotten a little bit too good for its britches. That's what my mom always used to say, prideful and arrogant. But we'll look at Genesis 11 as the first big example of when humanity has gotten a little bit too arrogant with regards to what they can do as an expression of the image of God bearing. But the representation of God as king, like father, like son, this is the idea. And this is Moses' second theological idea that I think he starts to introduce to Israel. So Adam representing humanity, representing the king. And so like father, like son. And it's interesting, I know a lot of you are parents out there, and good parents know this principle really well. I call this the open house experience. My wife and I used to love going to open houses for our kids' school, elementary school, and in Texas, the intermediate school, and then the junior high school. And eventually, when they get to high school, they tell you, don't go to open house, stay home, don't embarrass me. But when they're younger, it's okay. But it was always cool when we'd go and we'd, I love to hear the teachers talk about my kids. Now, I'm not trying to be a braggart. We did pretty well as parents. We're not perfect. But I like to hear the feedback loop coming back from the teachers, because when my kids were away from mom and dad on their own, doing their own thing, I was always interested in knowing how well were they representing the Smith name and the Smith reputation, which, would be hardworking, respectful, caring, and kind. Some of those qualities that I want them to walk around with and demonstrate when they're interacting with their workaday world in school, which is their job. It's what they're getting paid to go to their job. So we instill that. Because the teachers would report back to me, your kids are just really doing a great job. I really appreciate them for how caring they are of their peers, how they are respectful and they get their assignments in on time and always do their best. And I was like, yes. They're carrying the name and the reputation of Smith. They're planting the flag of Greg and Ellen Smith right in the middle of their classroom. You know, not as a testimony to me, of course. Glory to God for that. But it's the idea here. And so when Israel gets to the land, Moses is saying, you know, this is theology 101. Israel as a nation, you collectively are representing the Lord when you go to the land. Guess who's going to be watching? The pagans around, the pagan nations. Some of them you're going to have to drive out. The ones around, the boundary markers, over the fence, neighbors will be watching you. And guess what I want them to see? Moses is saying, the name and reputation of Yahweh. So that's what was supposed to happen. So this is a like father, like son idea. Yes, question?
Yeah, there's a question on the internet. We were having a rousing discussion about Psalm 8, that verse 5.
Psalm 8 now. We're back to Psalm 8.
Well, it's there. We're on this word, angels or God.
The controversy begins.
Yes. So, and that.
Where are we?
We're bringing up. Well, Hebrews 8, verse 5, you were made.
Hebrews 8?
I mean, Psalm,
Oh, okay.
Psalm 8.
We don't talk about the New Testament in this class.
No, this is why we talk about the New Testament.
Yeah.
Hebrews,
Okay.
because Hebrews pulls that same passage in and says, you made him lower than the angels for a short time. So there, Hebrews is seeing that as a messianic psalm. And I think the struggle on the internet here on the chat is, does this change the impact of that passage as a messianic psalm if you change that to a little less than God and not angels? Is he speaking about a messianic psalm, or is he speaking about a does that make sense as a question? I'm trying to translate a little bit.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Because Hebrews is quoting, he's saying that Hebrews is quoting the Septuagint.
Yeah, I was going to bring up the Septuagint and the Greek translation of the Old Testament, and they probably saw Elohim, and they're using angels.
Yes.
Yeah, and the problem that you have with the Hebrew text, which is what we have here, and the activity of interpretation is going to involve a both and. So I think that you can allow the text to speak on its own terms from the psalmist context here in Psalm 8, a Psalm of David. And the translation God, I might think, fits perfectly in terms of his context, because David's reflecting on creation and the elevation of the image of God in the context of creation as a means of worship. The author of Hebrews is pulling from the Septuagint, bringing it into his context where the discussion is on Christ and some of those other things that I have to go back and look at. I can't pull them instant recall, but the author there, the author of Hebrews, is going, we have to let him make his message speak. Because it's not that he's getting the Hebrew context incorrect. He's bringing the idea of Elohim into his context, but with the focus on the Christ context. And Christ has come on the scene, and everything that he's unpacking there, I think we have to let him speak on his own terms. Not in the fact that he's in somehow contradicting David in Psalm 8, but if you got both of the authors sitting around in a Starbucks tomorrow having this conversation, you'd be surprised what you'd hear. But at the end of the day, I think at the end of the conversation, you have both authors, the author of Hebrews and David, looking at each other saying, wow, we were talking about the same thing. You know, I think that's what you have to do. That was kind of shallow, I know, but sorry. That's the best I can do on Johnny on the spot. But yeah, Moses is in the context of, this lesson for Israel. They have to understand that they're representing their father, their God. When they go in and express covenant life and relationship in the land. So fill, multiply, and rule and subdue. All of those commands that Adam receives as an image of God bearer. In the land, when Israel gets there, it's fill, multiply, rule, and subdue all over again. Rule and subdue, especially because we know that battles will have to fought against we'll call it the war against the paganism that's well entrenched in the promised land. It's going to have to happen through confrontation. But after that, we're going to establish the rule and the dominion of the king. And our realm, the promised land, that'll be our domain, will be expressing covenant relationship through all that Moses has taught us and instructed us to do. How to have church, the tabernacle, sacrificial system, the life of faith, trusting in Him daily, the provision, the blessing, the extension of life. And the idea is that Israel is the center of that activity in the world, expanding it. And the nations around are watching and saying, we're a little discouraged about our God, and we kind of are interested in their God. We want to get to know more about Him, whoever that God is. Something's happening over there in Israel, and it's something that's unique on planet Earth, and none of us pagans are seeing it happen in our context. We want to go over there and understand what's going on over there. So that was kind of the idea of name and reputation as it continues to expand. So let's keep going here. So a little bit more on this is a scene from Monty Python. I don't know if it fit or not, but where this goes, we have and look back in Genesis 1. Genesis 1, 26 and 27. I don't know if I mentioned this yet, but this is what we're talking about. The central verse. There. Then God said, let us make man in our image. According to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish, the sea, over the birds of the sky. They're ruling over, right? The cattle and over all of the earth, over the creepy things on the earth. And God created man in His image. In the image of God He created him. Male and female He created them. Male and female He created them. How much confusion in the world today is there on that one? That's another thing I heard when I went to my Association for Theological Schools meeting. The whole LGBT thing is just creeping in all over the place, and the Department of Education is putting pressure, more and more pressure on schools that receive government funding for their students, and the leverage is we'll take away funding unless you line up with our agenda for LGBT. That's the threat, and that's starting in California. It's starting to creep in. All things start in California, make their way across the United States. So hopefully not anybody out there is watching from Association for Theological Schools anyway. But yeah, this is the significance of the image of God. Adam is like God, but he's not God. And Moses even begins to, lay out, like we said earlier, the boundary lines between man and God. So the significance of the image of God. Carrying out the name, reputation, through our obedience to the commands that we receive, like Adam, Israel learns and has their set of instructions. Adam is also executing his little kingly responsibility through we see later the naming of the animals, just like God did. God naming and assigning function to living things. And the image of God puts us in a unique and privileged position to share, you might say, space with God. That's the relational aspect. Life in the garden, the temple will become the place for the establishment of the name and the reputation. God says at a place that I will choose. When you get to the land, I'll let you know when time's right. Build the temple, and it's the center for the activity. So this is how it all ties back into the this bookend idea. And interestingly, and I've already brought this up, but a little mini bookend that we have in Genesis 1 through 11. So if you go to the very last chapter, Genesis 11, and you see what the effects of the fall has on this idea of the image of God bearing. And sometimes we look for similarity in language that sometimes is the author's attempt to establish a connection. And you see the repeated language in I call it the verse of rebellion in chapter 11, verse 4. Well, it starts in verse 3. So the people on the plain or the land of Shinar, they say to themselves, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they used brick for stone, and they used tar for mortar. They're building a tower. Some people call it a siege tower because they're bent on destroying something or someone. They said, "Come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach into heaven. And come, let us make for ourselves a name, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth." This is a group of people who are rebelling against the commands to fill, multiply, rule, and subdue. We want to stay put. And two, we don't even want to plant the flag of Yahweh anywhere we go. We're building for ourselves. Come, let us make for ourselves. You hear it in the tone of voice. Come, let us make for ourselves a name for ourselves. So this is the defiance. Talk to the hand because the face ain't listening. But it carries back to the come, let us make for ourselves, coming from the divine counsel. You know, the plural of majesty is speaking in Genesis 1. Come, let us make man in our image. So this is how that connects. But we'll unpack that as we keep going here. I just wanted to bring it out here in terms of where this goes post-fall. Is the image, the name-bearing responsibility is called into question. And you'll see me develop this as we unpack the problem of paganism in the Promised Land when we get to Deuteronomy and some of the more difficult texts that seem to call for war. God's all about war, you know. He's mean and vindictive and all this stuff. But the problem with well-entrenched paganism is what it does to the image of God. It destroys the image of God wherever it is, and wherever it's well-entrenched. It redefines the image of God. LGBT. The differences between male and female are blurred and confused intentionally. And the fullness of being male, the fullness of being female becomes an option because we're building for ourselves a name. See? And that's the driving force behind paganism in all of its forms, wherever it's shown up in history. You've got this confusion. And in the Promised Land, there's going to be confusion with regards to sexual identity. There's pagan prostitutions. There's, as we'll see, child sacrifice going on. The devaluing of the unborn child, you might say, or the born but young child being thrown off as a sacrifice. Talk about the devaluing of human beings. So in our modern context, of course, we have the abortion movement. So how it all kind of connects. So we'll talk more about this. Well, some aspects of modern science we have to be careful because modern science is all built on the back of, I would argue, it's somewhat foundational to the idea of humanity out there in rebellion against God, building for themselves a name. And we see science building its siege tower in a way against the name of God, the name building. You know, and this is a statement I just kind of wrote myself. We are here by, this is the cry of rebellious humanity. We're here by chance on a planet, third rock from the sun, with no universal significance or importance, except that which we define for ourselves. So through science and education, we expect to build a civilization that can reach the stars in discovery, where we discover perhaps even why we are here. So we press on, and through scientific innovations, we can defeat death, define meaning and purpose for everyone, which includes now more than ever sexual roles, preferences, lifestyles, and function, and save the world. You know, it's kind of a modern rally cry. Now, I just want to play a video clip here. I hope it works. That I think brings together a lot of this and encapsulates. This comes from an old movie where there's an interview with Ben Stein and this radical atheist named Richard Dawkins. Maybe you've heard of him? Yeah. So this is fun, and it brings together a lot of the scientific confusion out there with regards to what is the value of human beings and the image of God and humanity and some of these things. So let's just watch this really quick here. I hope it works. Yes.
Hello, Professor Dawkins. How are you? I'm Ben Stein. I'm sorry to keep you waiting. How are you?
Fine, thank you.
You have written that God is a psychotic delinquent invented by mad, deluded people.
No, I didn't say it like that. I said something rather better than that.
Oh, well, please tell us what you said. Please tell us what you said.
Well, I would have to read it from the book.
No, please.
The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully.
So that's what you think of God?
Yeah.
How about people believe in a God of infinite lovingness and kindness and forgiveness and generosity, sort of like the modern day God? Why spoil it for them?
Oh,
Why not just let them have their fun and enjoy it?
I mean, I don't want to spoil anything for anybody. I write a book, people can read it if they want to. I believe that it is a liberating thing to free yourself from primitive superstitions.
So religion's a primitive
Oh,
superstition.
I think it is, yes.
So you believe it's liberating to tell people that there is no God?
I think a lot of people, when they give up God, feel a great sense of release and freedom.
Why do you think that? I mean, what's your dad? What's your scientist? What's your dad?
I think, well, I've had a lot of letters saying that. And
There are 8 billion people in the world.
Yeah.
How many others do you have?
that's quite true.
Professor Dawkins seemed so convinced that God doesn't exist that I wondered if he would be willing to put a number on it.
Well, it's hard to put a figure on it, but I mean, I put it as something like 99% against or something.
Well, how do you know it's 99%? You say it, not 97.
No, you argued it. I'm not comfortable putting a figure on it. I just think it's very unlikely.
What? But you couldn't put a number on
No, of course not.
it. So it would be 49%.
Well, it would be. I mean, I think it's unlikely, but and it's quite far from 50%.
How do you know?
I don't know. I mean, I put an argument in the book.
Well, then who did create the heavens and the earth?
Why do you use the word who? You see, you immediately beg the question by using the word who.
Well, then how did it get created?
Well, by a very slow process.
Well, how did it start?
Nobody knows how that started. We know the kind of event it must have been. We know the sort of event that must have happened for the origin of life.
What was that?
It was the origin of the first self-replicating molecule.
Right, how did that happen?
I totally don't know.
So you have no idea how it started?
Nor has anyone.
Nor has anyone else. What do you think is the possibility that intelligent design might turn out to be the answer to some issues in genetics or in evolution?
It could come about in the following way. It could be that at some earlier time, somewhere in the universe, a civilization evolved by probably some kind of Darwinian means to a very, very high level of technology and designed a form of life that they seeded onto perhaps this planet. That is a possibility, and that's an intriguing possibility. And I suppose it's possible that you might find evidence for that if you look at the details of biochemistry, molecular biology. You might find a signature of some sort of designer.
Wait a second. Richard Dawkins thought intelligent design might be a legitimate pursuit?
And that designer could well be a higher intelligence from elsewhere in the universe. But that higher intelligence would itself have had to have come about by some explicable, or ultimately explicable process. It couldn't have just jumped into existence spontaneously. That's the point.
So Professor Dawkins was not against intelligent design, just certain types of designers, such as God. So the Hebrew God, the God of the Old Testament, he doesn't exist in your view.
Certainly, I mean, that would be a very unpleasant prospect.
And the Holy Trinity of the New Testament.
Nothing like that.
Do you believe in any of the Hindu gods? Like
How can you answer such a question?
You don't
How
believe.
could I?
You believe.
Why would I, given that I don't believe in any others?
You don't believe in Muslim God?
No. Then why do you even need to ask?
Well, I just wanted to be sure. So you don't believe in any God anywhere?
Any God anywhere would be completely incompatible with anything that I've said in
I just wanted to make sure you don't believe in any God anywhere.
No.
What if after you died you ran into God? He said, what have you been doing, Richard? I mean, what have you been doing? Having God to be nice to you? gave you a multi-million-dollar paycheck over and over again with your book, and look what you did.
Bertrand Russell had a point put. He said something like, "Sir, why did you take such pains to hide yourself?"
Kind of sad, isn't it?
But if the intelligent design people are right, God isn't hidden. We may even be able to encounter God through science, if we have the freedom to go there. What could be more intriguing than that?
Okay. So you get an idea there of, I think Richard Dawkins speaks, he's more of the militaristic, you might say, atheist voice behind science. But it's interesting where they end up going with the question of, can these two processes, the driving forces behind Darwinian evolution, chance and natural selection, or survival of the fittest, those things working together in some way to produce life? And he's readily admitting nobody knows how these processes can come about and bring together the first living self-replicating cell and the complexity of life and all of its form. Me personally, and you'll see this come out in next week's lecture, but as I'm arguing or trying to form an argument against Darwinian evolution, I go with the complexity of life, the amazing complexity of life arguments that are coming about. The more that we learn about DNA, to learn, all the things we're discovering about how the body works, how cells work, and we're getting down to the very small, and understanding these things are amazing. What's going on under the microscope and under the electron microscope, and none of the things that Darwin himself was able to see other than just a blob. That's all he saw when he looked at a cell. So there was, they basically can't explain this origin of life. They're struggling. And the only thing that they've got, and the reason why there's so much money going into efforts like SETI, right, the search for extraterrestrial life, is that they want to find life on another planet so they can understand where life came from on this planet, because it didn't come from these processes on this planet. That's what they're starting to admit. No way chance and natural selection can produce the complexity of life that we currently are learning about and seeing. The honest scientists will admit that. Dawkins kind of sort of did in a kind of a bumbling fool on the stage way, but Ben Stein pushed him that direction. You heard him say, life from another planet, ET, extraterrestrial, has to come from someplace else. But if it did, Darwinian evolution would have had to have worked on that planet for a long time. See? All right. So it's a circular argument at that point. But what's lost in all of this confusion, is the image of God value on human beings and for human beings around the whole planet. The devaluing of the human being scientifically shows up with the funding behind the abortion movement and some of these things. And even in history, we could talk about the atrocities of World War II and how the German scientific community at the time, fueled by Darwinian thought and the supremacy of the human white race and the devaluing of one particular race called the Jews, and how they were treated in World War II, stems from a lot of this kind of Darwinian thought. Well, that's another controversial topic. But we are uniquely human beings, and it drives us to relationship with God, our Creator, in a unique way, with our brains and our mouth and our eyes and our ears to process information in a unique way, different from apes and ancient monkeys and any kind of critter that shows up in the fossil record, a hominid or a Neanderthal or a modern-day Sasquatch. You've all heard about him. I'm just kidding. I just recently went to Disney and Animal Kingdom, and I love the Yeti ride, Anyway, it's just another topic, sorry. All right, so this next video clip that I want to show you, I think we've got time, is talks more about these processes with regards to how can these processes get to this. And one of the best theories that's out there will be summarized by the interview that we'll see next. So let's just focus on this next little video clip. I hope I'm not boring you to death here. How's the sound coming through? Anybody complaining about the sound?
This is the story of a small
Might be too
planet
loud.
in space called Earth.
For a typical Darwinian explanation of how life originated, Dr. Wells directed me toward this documentary.
The chemical elements essential for life, hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, and nitrogen, were now in place. What was needed was a way of combining them. Perhaps the energy came from lightning. Whatever it was,
Excuse me?
whatever it was, energy managed to arrange these chemical ingredients in just the right way.
Whatever it was? I was hoping for something a little more scientific. The most popular idea has been that life emerged spontaneously from primordial soup. In 1953, Stanley Miller mixed water, methane, ammonia, and hydrogen to simulate the early Earth's atmosphere. Then he ran electricity through it in an attempt to jumpstart life. It didn't work. While the initial results seemed promising, 50 years later, most serious scientists have abandoned this approach in favor of alternate theories. Prominent Darwinist Michael Ruse attempted to explain one of them to me. He wasn't kidding. How did we get from an inorganic world to the world of the cell?
Well, one popular theory is that it might have started off on the backs of crystals. Molecules piggybacked on the back of crystals forming, and that this led to more and more complex. But of course, the nice thing about crystals is every now and then you get mistakes, mutations, and that this opens the way for natural selection.
But at one point there was not a living thing.
Yeah.
Then there was a living thing. How did that come?
Well, I just told you. I don't see any reason why you shouldn't go from very simple to more and more complex to more and more.
I don't either, but I don't know how you get from mud to a living cell. That's my question.
Yes, well, I've told you.
I think it's on
Try one more time.
the backs of crystals.
On the backs of crystals is at least one hypothesis, yes.
So that's your theory. You think that is more likely and less far-fetched than intelligent design?
I think it is.
I wouldn't put Ben Stein's money on Dr. Ruse's joyriding crystals, but it did make me wonder, what were the chances of life arising on its own?
It's been speculated that probably there would have to be a minimum of about 250 proteins to provide minimal-like function. If that's really true, then I think it's almost inconceivable that life could happen in some simple step-by-step way.
Okay, so the simplest form of life requires at least 250 proteins to function. What's so difficult about that?
Welcome to the Casino of Life. Who wants to spin for a chance to win?
Oh, sure. I'll give it a shot. What do I win?
Take a look at this.
How about the world's first single-cell organism? This perfectly aligned string of proteins could be yours.
Now, take a spin.
I won.
Tina, tell him how many times he needs to do that to win the prize.
250.
That's right, folks, and all in the correct order.
But that's impossible.
We've heard that before, haven't we, Richard?
Come on, Mother Nature. Do your thing.
You stupid machine! I hate you!
So we wonder why there's confusion in our world and our culture today about significance. Why am I here? What value do I have as a human being? I'll just be real with y'all. Last week I got a phone call from an old high school friend. We keep in touch over, I'm not a big social media guy, but we do keep in touch, and called me out of the blue and said, I need to talk to you on the phone. He didn't say why. He texted me first and said, are you available? And I said, I'll call you on my way home from work. And it was last Friday on my way home, and I'm talking to my friend Charlie about a mutual friend from high school, Steve, who committed suicide. Has that ever happened to you? Suicide. People who are struggling with, why am I here? What's my meaning and purpose? And Where do I find my purpose and meaning in life in a world that seems to be explained by chance and natural selection? So my survivability, it's all about running faster on the African plain, being one-upsmanship. And, he was caught up in the corporate ladder, and he lost his job recently. And a couple of significant people in his life had passed away. And he was struggling with stuff. So this is where the rubber meets the road for a lot of the people who are in our churches and our congregations and our pews. When you are sharing with them through teaching and preaching, we need to reinforce the significance of who we are as image of God bearers. And granted, we may not have our life fully figured out and all the problems solved, but we can't deviate too far from that and encouraging others to, you're significant. You can contribute. God's given you a job description, and that's an important thing to include in our ministries. But this complexity of life, I've shown this slide before, but it kind of gets into a little bit about what you heard in the short video clip. 250 proteins for life to exist, aka the first self-replicating cell, even before these processes of chance and natural selection can start to work. See, you have to have this first. And you see evidence of this in some of the details that I give you in this, and with regards to the idea that other than sex and blood cells, every cell in your body is making approximately, so this is the living cell idea. What's going on under our skin? Approximately 2,000 proteins every second. A protein is a combination of 300 to over 1,000 amino acids, building blocks for life. An adult human body is made of approximately 75 trillion cells. Every second of every minute of every day, our bodies organize in the order of 150,000 amino acids into carefully constructed chains of protein every minute of every day, every second, every minute, every day. The fabric from which we in all life is built is being continually rewoven at a most astounding rate. All of that's going on for life to exist. How does chance and natural selection produce this complexity? That's the question that Richard Dawkins can't solve and will readily admit if pushed to an awkward situation on stage or in an honest conversation. We don't know. We don't really know. So this has to come from another source, not on planet Earth, but somewhere out here. I had a roommate my freshman year at Purdue. This is probably what drove me to the Lord too. But he was convinced that he was from the planet Quatar. He was really, really strange. Watch out, his freshman roommates. But we're looking for life on other planets. All right, well, let's move to our next... we're still talking about lesson 2 a little bit, just as a way of wrapping up. But the significance, again, for Israel is they recognize their status on an individual basis, but as a nation, to represent the name of Yahweh where they go, his reputation, his name, his image. And they're planting his flag. This is where they're going in the promised land, and this is what they understand as Moses is giving them this lesson, this theological lesson, from the pages of Genesis 1 through 11 on the struggle that's about ready to occur. So this is, let's see. So I think that's all I want to say there. Now let me introduce to you, this is one of those wet cement conversations. Being an engineer, I gravitate to science, and I enjoy engaging in various scientific discussions. So a little bit of this is coming from my love for science, but there's a debate out right now that stems from what we're talking about in class, and maybe you've encountered it in your congregations, in your youth groups, but it's the question of, given some scientific discovery, the question of Adam. Because if we're out there looking at the geological record and we're trying to figure all this out, and there's people ask questions about hominids and ancient skulls and artifacts in the rocks and the geological record out there, and Neanderthals and all of this. Where does this all fit with regards to the first image of God bearing representative on planet Earth? Would we ask this question that maybe in some way, although we don't want to push the biblical context too far, because it's not given to us as a scientific manual, and it's not giving us and explaining things quite that way. But is there some reasonable connection that may be helpful here? So this is a question that I've attended the last few years at the Evangelical Theological Society and heard some discussions and some different representatives from, like, say, the Discovery Institute, Reasons to Believe, Hugh Ross's organization, some biblical scholars and different ones that have come in and wrestling with this question. So this is wet cement for me. I'm just giving it to you just to kind of give you some things to maybe consider looking at and thinking about. One book that I would recommend is the one by that comes out of Reasons to Believe. Hugh Ross's book, Who Was Adam, is a really fair treatment of some of the current issues in this discussion. But the questions of who, where, and how long ago. So I'm going to give you some interesting observations and some things that are still in wet cement for me as I'm exploring these things. My hunch is, in some of the evidence that we're seeing in recent DNA research and some of the discussion there, as well as some of the more longer-term discussion that's been about the artifacts, aka the bones and skeletons and stuff that we're finding that looks to be old. How does that all add up? So would there be evidence anywhere on the planet Earth for the first expression of the image of God bearing that we're talking about and what the first biblical author, Moses, gives us? So that's kind of what I'm looking at here. So I'm giving you the full disclaimer. This gets controversial, right? But this is what people are watching on Nat Geo and the Discovery Channel in your pews and in your youth groups. So we have to be prepared and understanding, well, what are they seeing and how can I help them and guide them, for example, in thinking through biblically about these things. So one of the things that we have to do if we're looking at artifacts such as skulls and skeletons and things like that, we may have to make a few assumptions just to allow the conversation to continue with regards to the timetable. So if we give the fossil record and the geological record timetable, if we take that at face value, we come up against this evidence of these fossils that the scientific community wants to take all of this and their various forms, different kinds of ancient ape-looking like creatures, hominids, Neanderthals, and all the various forms. But what they're wanting to do because of Darwinian evolution is line them up this way. So they end up with Homo sapien, which this is us, the human beings, image of God bearing. But the question is somewhat related to the Darwinian evolution theory wants to make this linear connection and lining up all these critters in some way, some kind of progression way, right? Lowest to highest, I guess. What we have the biblical record doing is perhaps talking about and allowing these to have existed sometime in history, if the fossil record is accurate in some way, right? They were created by God. They obviously lived for a time and died, and in some cases went extinct, except for Bigfoot. And I'm just kidding. But then aren't linked in any way to the uniqueness of the image of God bearer on the top here. That's us. The biblical argument is that this critter, this living being, named Joe here, he is unique. He's the image of God bearing. And that representation shows up in the archaeological evidence. All right, so let's just keep moving here. That's just to kind of set up the thought process. And broadly speaking, when we look at the hominid fossils, these ancient skulls largely, and the comparisons are done, and how this one looks like a human skull, and the similarities and all of that. However, there's some interesting, unique differences. I mean, anybody in elementary school growing up would say, well, that ape skull looks a lot like my skull. That means I'm related to that ape. No, not necessarily. There's certain, in what some scholars are recognizing is that instead of clear evolutionary shared pathways to modern humans, fossil evidence in some significant ways actually points to the uniqueness of various hominid species separate and from the human species, or Homo sapiens. So the differences are significant, and there's some unique and often understated differences. In other words, our human skulls are different than ape skulls. There's similarities, but there are some significant differences that make Homo sapien species, image of God-bearing species, separate from the animal world. So like an ape, like a monkey, like an ancient hominid, they're created by God, allowed to live and enjoyed by God the Creator for a time and eventually went extinct, but they're not connected to through the fossil record. Really, the advance lately has been with the whole DNA, or the study of the DNA and the genes. And this gets into the chemistry of the whole question. So again, while similarities do exist, significant differences are showing up in some of the more weightier areas. So with regards to DNA and how you might say the body is wired for itself, brain and cognitive development are the weightier differences in how DNA works with regards to in a monkey or an ape or a primate as opposed to Homo sapiens. We see common design, not common descent. It shouldn't surprise us then that God as a creator, you might think of him as an artist in residence. He's the ability to create. He may use similarities or common building blocks for all living things. And that those things show up in the DNA evidence. That shouldn't surprise us. God's going to, we have lungs, monkeys have lungs. We have a mouth, monkeys have a mouth. I mean, there's certain similarities in how the DNA works, but here are the implications. Hominids and Neanderthals, much like modern apes, share some of the same genome characteristics as human beings. However, the differences equate to observable behavior differences. Ancient apes were designed and created to be apes, and they acted like it. They did a great job as being apes. It's because they were. The DNA indicates that humanity is designed to reflect the image of God. So it should not surprise us to discover shared design features in all living created things. But there's DNA evidence to suggest that human beings are created uniquely and separate from apes, ancient apes, and any kind of ancient ape that you read about, all right? Finally, the first expression of the image of God. And this, gets controversial with the timing of it all. That's why it's all in wet cement for me. But when do we start to see this image of God-bearing expression show up in ancient artifacts? Human behaviors that are unique to, Homo sapiens as opposed to Neanderthals. And this is what we see, the archaeological evidence. There's some indicators, but this is controversial, of course. Anthropologists talk about, interestingly, a sociocultural Big Bang that occurred about 40,000 years ago. In other words, this spike. Things that we look and we see evidence in caves and tool making and civilizations seem to stay put, and evidence of advances in perhaps even written communication and the beginnings of that start to show up with this big bang of activity about 40,000 years ago. So when we see evidence of that, and one last slide here, and I'll end this. I hate to end today on this topic, but so now getting back to the more relevant question with regards to the first Adam and Eve and the first image of God-bearing couple. This is the scientific conversation. Interestingly, scientists are trying to figure this out and do their triangulation activity, and they point to and they refer to a mitochondrial Eve and a Y chromosomal Adam. It gets somewhat controversial and hard to explain what they mean, but this is from the scientists are pointing back to an original, they would not call it a couple, they'd call it a small community, but 100,000 to 150,000 years ago. So scientists would suggest that the evidence points to humanity emerging from a very small, they'd call a very small population, interestingly, somewhere in Africa, in terms of the first image of God bearing with regards to research in DNA and trying to do the extrapolation backwards in time. So if we talk loosely And again, this is loosely in terms of the fill and multiply, rule and subdue commands that the first image of God bearers received, Adam and Eve, somewhere here in the red-yellow region, and then fanning out from there is seems to be what we see indicative in the, in the archaeological evidence. Now, not all of us would agree on the exact timing of all of this, and that whole timetable gets controversial, and we talk about it, as an in-house church conversation. How old's the earth? How old is man? And all of that. My basic position, I'll just give it to you here, and then we'll have to end up for today. I'm a little more open to the evidence of the stones and the rocks and the age of the universe in terms of being, that's just how old it is. But it does not make me a Darwinian evolutionist. I'm not going that way. I speak about a young, if I talk about an old earth, your professor is going to talk about a man in terms of the first image of God-bearing expression, introduced by God, fully formed, fully functioning, somewhere on planet Earth. That's going to have a beginning and a starting point for me. And that's entirely within and lines up with the biblical account. So that's what I'm looking for there. Now that opens up other discussions and other controversies, but we'll figure that out next week when we come back and talk about the doctrine of creation, and we'll talk a little bit more about the age question and some of the parameters and some of the implications there for you as well as the people in your churches. So who might be asking this question and might be wrestling with it. All right, so we'll pick up there next week.